This is the Simplified Science Select Lecture, Change of Heart. There are no shortcuts in evolution, referring to the large time scale and just how slow evolution takes and how long it takes for any effect to really show up that's noticeable. Our learning goals: explain the theory of evolution, follow a diagram of relationships, and explain the change of traits. What we already know: organisms are all related. We know they're different, but also the same, and we also know that things change over time. What we learn in the lab are that some traits are better than others, depending on the environment you're in. We also know that the way a population looks at the start isn't necessarily how it looks at the end, after a long period of time. And we know that the reason that there's change is because there's some kind of pressure on them. Whether it's food source or environmental or something hunting them, there's some kind of challenge, conflict. So when we say speciation, what that means is how over time one population can be separated, and if they change enough, they'll become two different species. Recall that we said that the easiest way to tell if something is the same species or if it's a different species is whether or not they can mate with each other. So in this example, if we take this sample of fruit flies and they start off all the same species, meaning any of those fruit flies could mate with any other fruit fly of the opposite sex. Now if we separate them and we put them in two different environments, a starch and a maltose, two different environments, and we give it a really long time, lots and lots of time. The reason that we use fruit flies in the lab is because they only live a day or two, so that we can get through many generations in just a little bit. It's hard following many generations of, say, turtles, because they live for years and years and years. So you'd spend your whole life and you wouldn't get through that many seeing them. But you can see a bunch of generations of fruit flies in just a few weeks. So you wait to watch, mother to daughter to daughter to daughter, 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 and then after enough time has passed, you eventually, these tiny changes add up, and you start to see entire differences in the population, just like we saw in the lab. And then if you let them back out and you put them back with each other, you end up with two different species that they don't mate with each other anymore. That happens in the environment. Say, one group gets trapped on an island, or one group goes over here, and they divide the two different environments. It's important is that the environment's different. Whenever we look at something like this, called a cladogram, cladogram comes from the Greek klados, which means branch, and gramma, character. So this is showing us how the characteristics branch off. It shows us relationships. Sometimes you see it in this little angly tree thing, and sometimes you see them square design, but it's the same thing. So every time there's an intersection, it shows how things are different. So, for example, if we look at this intersection right here, this intersection shows me that everything to the left doesn't have vertebrae, and everything to the right does. And then this intersection here, all these have bony skeletons and those don't. All these have forelimbs and those don't. All these have amniotic eggs, kind of the way that their young develop. And all of these do not. Now you notice here, there can be branches after the branches, but everything to the left is going to be different than everything to the right. Now, we can have very complex cladograms. One like this, there's so much information going on, and we'd have to have a key to know what every branch is, but look how many different creatures there. But every place that there's a branch shows us a different characteristics. Now, a slightly different branch, or branch diagram, is called a phylogeny, or sometimes we call it a phylogenetic tree or a phylogenetic diagram. So this shows us not just the traits that are similar, but how they changed over time. We usually figure these out the easiest way using DNA to see if they have genes in common, but it shows ancestry. So our three domains, bacteria, archaea, and eukaryota. So this here would be that ancient primordial simple cell. They got divided, so they lived in two different areas. Some of them eventually changed to become bacteria. Some of them eventually changed to become not bacteria. And then from there, some became archaea and some became eukaryotes. Now, what makes these diagrams so hard to understand is we are literally talking about millions and millions of years. So the changes that happen from mother to daughter are imperceptible. They're so small and tiny. It takes thousands of generations of tiny little minute changes to happen before they become so different that we put a branch in this tree. Now, once we realized that things were changing, we needed a name, and we used the word evolution. That's all that word means. It is really as simple as that. Change over time. The fact that this finch here, slowly over time, depending what food was available, slowly the population changed to have different types of beaks. Now, this is commonly associated with a great scientist by the name of Charles Darwin. Now, people frequently get it wrong that Darwin invented or discovered evolution, which is not true. The idea of evolution had already been around for a long, long time. What Darwin wasn't describing was that this thing was happening. That had already been agreed upon. What Darwin documented through his observations on the Galapagos Islands was how it happened. How were things changing over time? What was the mechanism? And he published this in a monumental, very important article in 1859 called On the Origin of Species. Now, over time, this theory has been updated, but there is tons of evidence. Throughout the year, we're going to keep seeing evidence of how things are related. There's a reason that, for example, all of the animals all have nucleus, because one of their ancient ancestors, a different thing that is no longer around, developed a nucleus, and it was a very good, and everything after it has kept the nucleus. The similarities are indicative. Now, don't let the word theory trip you up either. In science, what the word theory means is more specific than we use it every day. Theory means a collection of evidence that has been proven that's all grouped together. For example, in science, we refer to the theory of gravity. In the everyday language, theory might be used for a guess. In science, that is not how it works. We do not guess that gravity exists. We have lots of evidence and lots of information to be able to make lots of good predictions about gravity. The same is true for evolution. Now, Darwin didn't come up with this idea, but he did solve some of the problems and put it together. Linnaeus had some work on this whenever he published his book Systema Naturae. And even one of Darwin's ancestors, Erasmus Darwin, wrote on this topic. And an important one, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he wrote on evolution as well. So what Darwin proposed was the mechanism of how it happened, and he called it natural selection, which is different than artificial selection. In artificial selection, we as people get to affect which animals breed together. For example, all the different breeds of dogs we have. We have different breeds of dogs because you and I, well, dog breeders, have been taking, hey, I like this dog that's fluffy and that dog that's fluffy. Let's put them together until they have fluffy puppies. And we kept selecting for fluffiness. The ones that were really fluffy, we kept breeding together, and we didn't breed the non-fluffy ones with them. Eventually, you end up these fluffy little dogs that are super fluffy. Or we pick for whatever trait. Dogs that are good at grabbing ducks for us when we hunt. Or dogs that are really small and we put in our purse for some reason. But we selected that kind of breeding. Natural selection is, how does nature select? So there's a couple parts to this. So the fact is that some organisms get to breed more than others. Some things out there have lots of kids, some have little. Now, there's lots of reasons why one organism might get to have more kids than another. It could be for a multiple of reasons. Whereas in artificial selection, we decide. There are lots of different kinds of dogs, and they all come from the artificial selection of humans breeding wolves. Now, after humans have been living alongside dogs for literally thousands of years, and so over the course of thousands of years, and all of those generations, the wolf has gone through speciation at our hands. We've artificially selected for different traits that we liked or wanted. So, what is the difference between artificial and natural selection, and why is that important? I'll let you pause and think. The important distinction is, why do they get to have more kids? That's what's important. Here's a proficient level question. On this cladogram, what is most closely related to the theropods? So we could probably guess that my theropods right here, including birds and other theropods, are probably most closely related with my saurischians, which includes these guys. These dinosaurs are probably most closely related to my theropods. More closely than these other ones are, probably. That would be a reasonable hypothesis. How is the way that the theory of evolution has changed over the centuries similar to the way that the theory of the shape of the Earth has changed over the centuries? Remember, we read an article by Isaac Asimov, The Relativity of Wrong. And so over time, as we've learned more, we have adapted our theory on how what the shape of the Earth is. Now, that didn't mean that we threw out all the information we had before. We just added more details to it, and we were able to make our theory better. The old one worked pretty well, but that didn't mean it was perfect. It has room for improvement. That's part of the honesty that science has. We're very honest that we never think that the things we do will ever become perfect, and so we keep working to refine them, to slowly improve and get more and more details, better and better predictions. And so the theory of evolution has made pretty good predictions about life on this planet. As we learn more and more and collect more and more evidence, we keep finding that those things are true. But the more information we have, we're able to tweak our theory and add more details and make even better predictions. Keep improving. A continual cycle of improvement. Okay, let's go over the logic here, because this is mainly a logic problem. So there are going to be 4 steps to the logic of this theory: variation, overproduction, adaptation, descent with modification. If we agree on all 4 of these 4 points, then we agree that this theory makes sense. So let's look at them individually. Variation. What we're saying that is that if you look at a population, not all the members are identical. If you look at a big grouping of butterflies, they might look very similar. Close enough to be the same species, they can breed with each other, but these small random mutations make everyone just slightly different. And they might be very slight. You might look at a bunch of squirrels running together in a tree and they all look like squirrels, but one might have a slightly longer tail. One might be a little darker in color. One might have slightly longer fur. One might have slightly sharper teeth. The reason they're different, it's just random. It's just random. These slight mutations. But this first point of the 4, the only thing we have to agree is here is when you look at any population, they're not identical. There are slight differences. Agreed? Agreed. That's true. Our second point is overproduction. Living organisms have as many kids as they can. This actually means they have so many kids that the environment couldn't actually support them all. There's not enough resources for them all to live, so they compete for them. They fight over who gets the food in the best houses. Now, at this point, I would like to pause and make the point that this applies to wild animals. Humans have artificial selection. We do not go through natural selection. Society and civilization means that, for example, we don't necessarily have as many kids as we can. Maybe some people do, but not everybody. But wild animals, other creatures, they do. Overproduction. So if you look at, for example, the picture here of lady beetles, these ladybugs, they're going to have as many little baby ladybugs as they can. And all these little baby beetles are going to go out and they're going to try to find food, they're going to try to find shelter, and they're going to try to find mates too. They're going to get as many as they can. There's always overproduction because there's always competition. If there was extra resources, then what would happen is they would just have even more kids just to use up all those resources. So if we agree that overproduction happens, which we observe in nature, then we've agreed to the second of the 4 points. Let's look at the third point. Adaptation. This is the idea that depending on where you live, it all depends on the environment. Some of those little differences, remember the variation? Some of those little differences sometimes can be an advantage, sometimes can be a disadvantage. Like the color of your fur. We saw in our virtual lab that having white fur was an advantage up in the snow. It made you blend in. But having that same white fur was a disadvantage down in the forest because it made you stood out. Whether something is an advantage or a disadvantage depends purely on your environment and the challenges you face. Sometimes height is a good advantage. If in the environment you're in, you need to go and try to get things out of trees, being tall helps. But if you're in an environment where there's lots of small little cracks in the rock, being too big prevents you from getting inside there. Height could be a disadvantage. Having a big brain could be an advantage because you can think and figure things out. But it could be a disadvantage because it takes a lot of energy to run a brain. So if there's not tons of food available, then you might not be able to compete with things that are more energy efficient. It's all about competing. Some of those differences make you better at competing than others. So that's what we have to agree with about adaptation. That some things have some advantages and some things have disadvantages, just depending on where you live. If you agree with that, you've agreed with the third point in this logic. Our fourth point, descent with modification. What that means is that kids have a lot more in common with their parents than any other member of the population. If you look at all the people you go to school with, they're similar to you because they're humans. They have a lot in common with you, but they don't have quite as much in common with you as you have with your parents. Now, you're not identical to your parents. You're not identical. There's lots of little differences. Slightly different hair colors, slightly different skin tones, slightly different muscular structure, slightly different heights. There's all kinds of small little differences that adds up, but you still have a lot in common with them. but you're not identical. But the point is, you're more likely to have traits that gave their parents the advantage they needed to have kids. So whoever is having kids, say these rodents or these horses, the ones having the most kids are having kids that are mostly like them. So if you agree with our fourth point, which is that when organisms have kids, they tend to be pretty similar to them, but not the same, but pretty similar, then that is our fourth point. So all four ideas together, if you agreed with all four, that is the theory of evolution. Now, a very common mistake is mistaking this for what's called teleological. Teleological comes from the Greek word teleos, which is a goal, and logos, theory. Evolution is not necessarily teleological. Artificial selection is, meaning in artificial selection, we actually have a goal whenever we're doing it. So whenever the breeders are choosing which dogs get to have puppies, they specifically chose the fluffy ones because they had a reason to choose them. They had a goal in mind before they decided which ones got to breed. In natural selection, there is no goal. There is not a perfect endpoint that the animals are trying to become. That does not happen. That was an old theory. Lamarck had that theory, but that theory got improved upon and refined by Charles Darwin. So, for example, under the old theory that didn't quite figure out the natural selection component of evolution, they had the wrong idea that giraffes had long necks because they wanted to have long necks, that they just stretched and stretched and stretched until they made their necks longer. But that is not actually how natural selection works. The reason that the way that natural selection works is that all the giraffes are slightly different. Remember, there's variation. Some of them have slightly longer necks than others. The ones that have slightly longer necks, that's an advantageous adaptation. Remember the second point? Adaptation. Now, because of that advantage of that adaptation, having a slightly longer neck, they get a little bit more food than the other people do. Remember our third point, overproduction? Not quite enough food for everyone. So the ones with just slightly longer necks, maybe it's just an inch longer, they get just a little bit more food. So they're more likely to be able to survive during a drought, to be able to have more kids. And remember our fourth point, descent with modification? The ones having the most kids are the ones with the slightly longer necks. So over time, slowly, thousands of years, they slowly get slightly longer, slightly longer, slightly longer. Developing question, what are the four main parts of the logic that natural selection follows? So that was variation, adaptation, overproduction, descent with modification. A proficient question. How would Darwin explain changes in the shape of a bird's beak over many generations? Okay, so let's look at the first finches to arrive on the island. Charles Darwin he really did observe these finches, and he wrote it down in his article on the origin of species. He was on the island chain called the Galapagos Islands. So a finch that looked like the one in the middle was the first kind of finch to make it out there. And so there is variation. Remember, there's variation. So of these finches, some of them had slightly narrower beaks, some had slightly longer, some had slightly stronger. They all had slight differences. Now, depending on what they were trying to eat, some of them were more effective than others. Remember, adaptation depends on what you're trying to eat. So, the ones that were trying to eat insects had a small beak that was able to reach into the tiny little holes the insects were living in, be able to get them inside and pull them out right out of the holes of the trees they had burrowed into. Whereas the bird that was trying to eat fruit had a wider, stronger beak that was able to bite big chunks and really get a grab of them. So depending on what they're trying to do, remember, adaptation all depends on the challenge. Some of them had an advantage over others. Now, because of overproduction, the ones that were getting more food were able to have more kids. And then, because of descent with modification, as they had kids, they were pretty likely to have the advantage that their parents had. And so those advantages got passed on. And just like we saw in the virtual lab, if you keep passing on those advantages enough, eventually, slowly, over many, many generations, your population starts to look different. A mastery question. How have humans changed over the last 10,000 years? So this graph is cranial capacity, meaning how big of a space did our brains have? How big were our brains? Well, it looks like over time, it looks like our brain size has gone slightly, generally up. We have this data, all these data points from fossils we found over time. The farther we look back, the smaller our brains have been. That means that having a larger brain was probably an advantage. That's why our population, we start to see more and more and more of it. That adaptation proved useful. And so through descent with modification, the children were likely to have that too.